But the reality is Joseph didn't have any of the skills, any proficiency or expertise in the literary skills, oratorical skills, compositional skills that a person would naturally expect a person to need to be able to dictate a book like the Book of Mormon. And the point is that we don't know really anything about eternal marriage. And we know even less about eternal plural marriage. What would that even mean? If we say Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy, if we just isolate those denials and we make them be a lot more than they really ever were, then we have to confront the reality that Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Lorenzo Snow all described how Joseph Smith did enter polygamy and instructed them to enter into polygamy, even presiding over some of their plural marriages.
Welcome in here on Zion Media, and I'm really excited for this interview. It seems like as we get bigger and bigger, so do our guests. And it's been an amazing, I guess, almost year since we've been doing these podcasts. I'm joined by David the Lion Douglas. Trevor is not with us, and Brian, he wanted to be here. He's got so much going on in Babylon that he said, Shane, can you handle this? But I'm joined by Brian Hales, Dr. Brian Hales, or retired Dr. Brian Hales. And you may have seen him on a variety of other podcasts. He has authored, I think, 6 books on Mormon polygamy, and is involved in so many cool things. He's doing, has a project we'll talk about that relates to the origin of the Book of Mormon. So he's doing so many cool things as far as the history of the church goes, and just a stalwart member of the church, and actually is in Nauvoo right now. So he's joining us from Nauvoo. And you're actually a missionary for the church out there right now. And I know you can't talk a ton about what's going on, and you're on our show in the capacity of Brian Hales. But Brian, maybe just give us and our viewers a little bit of introduction. Most of our viewers are going to know who you are, but tell us a little bit about what you got going on. David, you got something?
Wait, and I love asking missionaries this. Tell us also, as a part of that, why you wanted to serve the mission. I don't know if you could say that, but I think that would be great to learn your passion.
Well, I appreciate those questions. I was excited to serve a mission as soon as I remarried a couple of years ago, but we spent a little time getting to know each other, and then put our papers in last summer, and we didn't know where we would go. We wanted to go to Palmyra. We got called to Salt Lake. And then we were asked to participate as one of several dozen scholars on research for the biography that Elder Oaks announced a couple of years ago entitled Joseph the Prophet. And Rick Turley is the author of that. And so that's what my wife and I are currently doing, is researching for that. That's what's brought us here to beautiful Nauvoo. You can't see it, but the Mississippi is right through those trees back there. And we're living out of an RV, so we're more portable to go from repository to repository. But I want to also make it really clear, and I appreciate this, Shane and David, I'm not on this podcast as a missionary, and I don't have my badge on. And my mission president said, you can participate in these things. Just make sure people know that you're speaking for yourself. And I want that put out there. Anything I say is just my responsibility, and no way am I representing the church here. But we're having a really good time, and I couldn't be happier researching Joseph Smith. So
before we jump into the question of polygamy, and we're going to get there, tell me a little bit about this project you're doing, because I love the Book of Mormon, and I want to hear about the book you're writing on the origins of the Book of Mormon.
Well, it can be a long answer, a short answer. When I was researching plural marriage back in 2007 to 2012, people would ask me, are you worried about what you're going to find out about Joseph? You know, it's kind of a controversial topic. And I was never worried, because I believe that in 1829, he didn't have the skills to create the Book of Mormon. And so I reasoned in my head he was a prophet in 1829, and so he must have just kept being a prophet, and there was nothing that I found in his personal life or decisions that made me believe that he ever lost the ability to be God's prophet. He was always a worthy. He wasn't perfect, but he was always worthy, and that was my finding. But then when I finished with my research on polygamy, probably 10 years ago, I thought, let's test the theory. Could Joseph Smith have created the Book of Mormon using his own intellect? Which incidentally is the most popular theory today. If you talk to naturalists or people leaving the church, oh yeah, he could do it. Just because I can't do it doesn't mean he can't do it. So we tested that by identifying the kind of skills, author skills, a person would need to dictate a book like the Book of Mormon. And then I have gone through and used the historical record to try to identify the skills that Joseph Smith had. And this will all be published next year in a book by coming out by Greg Colford Books. But the reality is Joseph didn't have any of the skills, any proficiency or expertise in the literary skills, oratorical skills, compositional skills that a person would naturally expect a person to need to be able to dictate a book like the Book of Mormon. And I very much document this with historical and even scientific kinds of observations. And I'll be interested in what the naturalists have to say about it, because to me it's really a very real evidence that there's something going on besides what we can explain through our natural senses.
What's kinda driven you? Because I know you were a doctor. What's kinda driven you to be kinda in this space of research and church history? What's kinda your origin, and how did you get started kinda going down this path?
Yeah, great question. And I appreciate the opportunity to share that. And back in the late 1980s, a member of my family was excommunicated for joining a polygamous group. And so I researched all of their literature. I read their history and realized that no one had actually written a history of the movement, of the primary movements. You know, we have the Liberans, we have the All Red group and the FLDS and the Kingstons, and nobody really written a history about how do these groups come out of the church and claim authority to do what they're doing. And so in 2006, Greg Colford Books published my first book really dealing with this topic. And then people were Joseph Smith's Polygamy, and which was just the first chapter of that book. And so in 2007, I hired Don Bradley. I don't know if he's been on your show, but he would be a good one. Don was a great researcher, and he did tons of research for me because I was working full time as an anesthesiologist. And in 2013, we came out with these 3 volumes on Joseph Smith. And maybe I should throw in my joke that I tell people it's part of my full anesthesia services. So anyway, that's kind of the history.
Okay. Okay. So tell me a little bit as well. As you started looking at Joseph Smith's polygamy, there's a lot of people out there right now that the term is now polygamy deniers. And we've had some people on Zion Media that I swear they are saying there is no way Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy. He's always been against polygamy. Based on your research, help me understand why people may think that, but why the historical record probably doesn't reflect that.
Well, it's a great question. And the idea of Joseph Smith not being a polygamist is not a new idea. It was the one of the 2 foundational ideas that I think supported the RLDS Church for over 100 years. Joseph Smith III wanted to show or remove that stigma from his father and worked very hard to do it. I think he was a good man, but he was advancing a false premise. And of course, the RLDS Church, which became the Community of Christ, and I have many good friends among them. They've kind of again, understood the historical record differently now, recognizing that the evidence is overwhelming that Joseph did introduce plural marriage. And so today, though, what we find is there's small factions attached to the church that will try to rewrite history to get rid of uncomfortable episodes or events and polygamy is certainly one of them. And trying to disconnect Joseph from it is what they do, and they use a variety of techniques that we can talk about. But another topic that people are trying to kind of expunge from from our collective historical memory is the reality that Joseph dictated the Book of Mormon while staring at a seer stone and a hat. Now that's weird. Seer stones are kind of weird, but there's a history there and a reason why Joseph was conditioned through his folk magic practices to be able to accept the Urim and Thummim, which was just two seer stones, set in a bow, and even then to transition over at some point, we don't know exactly when, to just looking at the seer stone and a hat, because then he didn't have to hide the artifacts from the people around him, among other reasons. But there are people who are trying to say, no, no, no. He always used the interpreters and he always used the plates and he always had a curtain. But there are dozens of accounts from eyewitnesses saying, no, that's not the case. So again, we find this propensity or this desire to take these uncomfortable details about our history and rewrite them in a more acceptable way.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, for me, I'm like, I don't care how it came to be. I've read the words. The words speak volumes in my mind. How it happened, I don't even care. I don't even get into those weeds because I know that it teaches us about our Savior Jesus Christ in in a way that I haven't found any other book that can do that. And so, however it came to be, I accept it and I'm grateful for it. Now, as we look at this, I guess this movement that's happening, what why is it that we're so uncomfortable? And maybe give me like there's a lot of people that say Fanny Alger, Alger, I don't know how to say it, had nothing to do with Joseph Smith, and there's controversy involving Fanny as well. Can you speak to any of the historical record as it relates to that relationship?
Yeah, Fanny Alger, and I'll be honest with you, there are people who have that as their last name, their surname, and they will pronounce it Alger or Alger. And I've talked to both of them over the years, and so take your pick. I think some of the family will say it Alger, and the others will say Alger. But as you know, Fanny Alger was a domestic in the Smith home in the probably no earlier than 1834. And at some point, there was a plural marriage ceremony performed by Levi Hancock. The evidences supporting this are not perfect. And that's where the or the doubter or the we could call them polygamy deniers. That's kind of derogatory. The monogamy affirmers is kind of a term they've adopted. But these people who doubt it will come in and point out all of the weaknesses, and there's weaknesses there. There almost always is. There's no historical data point that is perfect. And so you can take all of the supportive data, even eyewitness deposition statements under oath, and find some reason to doubt them. Well, it was late. It was 40 years after the fact or something. And people will just go through and knock down all of these data points. Well, with respect to Fanny, the evidence is far from perfect, but there's lots of them, and I have it in an appendix in the volume 2 of my trilogy. I accumulated all of the accounts. I think there's 19 that talk about Fanny in some way. That's quite a few, and when they're all telling the story of a relationship between Joseph. Now, some call it adultery and some call it a marriage. There is evidence a marriage ceremony was performed, that Fanny saw it as a marriage. Fanny's family saw it as a marriage. Families, the people that Fanny told about it all heard about it as a marriage, like the Webb family, where she went to stay after she left the Smith home. Um, but there are also accounts that refer to it as an affair. Nobody's accusing Joseph of polygamy openly. The critics are not using the word polygamy; they're using the word adultery. And Oliver and Emma did not accept it as an actual marriage. They rejected it, so they were considering it adultery. There's evidence for that. And yet it blew up so quickly, I think, that it really didn't last long. Now, my friend Don Bradley's written an article. It's quite persuasive that this marriage occurred probably after the sealing authority was restored on April 3rd, 1836, meaning that this was the first sealed marriage of this dispensation of the Restoration. I'm not sure the evidence is totally strong, but I don't think that if it occurred before that, it would have just been a for time only priesthood marriage that God would have recognized, even if the state of Ohio didn't. But even whether it was before or after, I don't think it lasted very long, because if you will visit Ohio now and go to Joseph Smith's home, it's been restored to the same size that it was when Joseph lived there, which is much, much smaller than it was when the church purchased the property 5 years ago. But they went through and discovered it's teeny. I mean, there's an upstairs, and then there's a back section, and then a main entryway. So if Joseph is having a marriage relationship with Fanny, unbeknownst to Emma, they're not going to be able to do very much for very long before Emma's going to get suspicious. And I asked one of the restored historians, "Where's the barn?" And he says, "We don't know. It could be out there, it could be down there, but the barn where Emma discovered them together, and we don't know exactly what would happen there. It may have been intimacy of some sort, or it may have been the marriage ceremony itself." But that's the first marriage, and Emma, of course, rejected it as a plural marriage, would have nothing to do with it. And it wasn't for many years later. Let's see, it'd be 7 years later before she actually accepted plural marriage, at least for a while. So
How did, as you've done your historical research, like, I feel like Oliver Cowdery is so important in church history, especially in those early days. How was this based on your research and in the introduction of, say, Fanny Alger and plural marriage? How did that sit with Oliver Cowdery?
well, what it is the people Fanny told heard that it was a plural marriage. The people that Joseph told about it thought it was adultery, irrespective of what he said. And Oliver was one of those. It's pretty clear. And I wrote an article years ago, because there are accounts that Oliver was entering polygamy in the early 1830s before Joseph. And I traced those down, and they're not that historical. And I don't think Oliver ever was a polygamist. I don't think he ever would have participated. And so when he heard Joseph was doing it, he was not receptive to that. There is another article that Don Bradley co-authored with Chris Smith, where he goes through and he talks about how there may have been an adoption ordinance or something going on there as well. And it's fascinating material. I just don't think we have enough primary documentation to know exactly what happened. But Joseph did consider it a plural marriage. That's what Eliza R. Snow, who was there. Eliza R. Snow was there teaching the Smith family, and she later wrote that, or she later communicated to Andrew Jensen that she was well acquainted with Fanny and listed Fanny as one of Joseph's plural wives. Again, evidence that there was a marriage, and that in the religious context for Joseph and Fanny, it was considered the first plural marriage of this dispensation. So.
Now, there's a lot of lore behind this next question I'm going to ask you, and that is the angel with the drawn sword. What can you tell me about the angel that came to Joseph Smith and told him to practice plural marriage? Is this a real story? Is this something that's made up? But do you know the story I'm referencing?
Yeah. Oh, yes. It's very important, because Section 132, contrary to what our fundamentalist polygamous friends sometimes want to assert, Section 132 does not command plural marriage. It says, "Go and do the works of Abraham," but plural marriage in Abraham's day or any day requires authority. You can't freelance plural marriage. Neither could Joseph Smith. And yet he was given sealing authority, and it's talked about in Section 132. But nowhere in there does it command the church membership in general to start practicing polygamy. That command for Joseph it came from this angel visit. And I wrote an article on that. I know I shouldn't keep saying that, but it's referenced in the Gospel Topic essay. But where I did is I accumulated 20, I think there's 23 now, accounts, historical accounts describing Joseph telling of the angel with the sword. It wasn't a flaming sword, by the way. There's one of the 23 accounts that calls it a flaming sword, and that's by a non-Mormon, ostensibly quoting Eliza R. Snow, and Eliza is quoted elsewhere, and it's not a flaming sword. So sometimes people get that mixed up. But what they say is that this angel commanded Joseph to practice plural marriage. And what's interesting is that One of these people who were remembering this is Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, who was a plural wife of Joseph, but he said that the angel didn't just come once with the sword. The angel first came in 1834 in July and told Joseph to do this. And of course, that would make sense that the following year or so, he enters into this Fanny Alger plural marriage. And then there's a second visit. We don't have a date for that, but the third visit occurs in early in February of 1842. What's interesting is if you look at Joseph Smith's plural sealings, before that date, most of them, in fact, you could say all of them, are to legally married women and they're just for eternity only. And then the angel appears, and suddenly he's proposing to young women with whom he would have a full marriage relationship for time and eternity, would be our today's verbiage. And that occurs after that date, and then we have evidence of sexuality in, a handful of those relationships. But before the angel came the third time, according to Mary Elizabeth Rollins' multiple testimonies, Joseph was not being married plurally to women for time and eternity. They were just for eternity only.
Interesting.
Did I
Okay.
answer your
Uh,
did I get through that?
That's very helpful because I know that gets brought up about the angel coming. Okay, so you've referenced DNC 132, and I want to clear the air because I think there's still people that think that in order to obtain the highest degree of the celestial kingdom, one must practice polygamy. Um, can you speak to what is the truth? What is the truth here in order for us as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to achieve the highest degree of celestial kingdom? Is polygamy mandatory?
No, no, it isn't. Multiple observations support that interpretation is faulty. Let me see if I can remember all of them. One is, if it were mandatory, we would probably expect it to be in the Book of Mormon, which is the keystone of our religion and the most correct book. But moreover, I did a research project years ago trying to find the key holder, the president of the church, saying that every exalted man is a polygamist in an unambiguous wording. It wouldn't be hard to say if it were true. Why wouldn't you say it? Especially during the time that it was commanded, and that's 1840s to 1890. The saints were sometimes taught that you needed to be a polygamist to receive all of God's blessings, but it was never something that was mandated for all people in all places and at all times. No prophet has ever taught that that is the case, and I don't believe that it's true. Our current leaders would affirm that to be the case as well. So it isn't something that we're going to have to do. I don't believe I'll be a polygamist in eternity, perhaps, I guess, but it's not something that I think will have to happen if I'm going to be exalted. And let me just add here, and I understand why women especially could be afraid of eternal polygamy. But the point is that we don't know really anything about eternal marriage, and we know even less about eternal plural marriage. What would that even mean? We know on earth that mortal polygamy is really tough. It fractures the bond of
Relationships. Yeah.
intimacy. Yeah, the exclusivity of a monogamous relationship, it fractures that, and it makes there's all kinds of reasons that it's hard here. It divides the man's time and resources and however they want to divide up. But in eternity, how can we even know where there's infinite time, where there's infinite love, where all of these things, we just cannot judge what that might be. Now, I understand that's not going to make people feel really good, but it's our reality, and it takes some faith. But it isn't something that I think any person is going to be forced to participate in if they're worthy. I believe that if we live worthily to be exalted, there will be. Let me tell you a story, and we don't hear this very often, but it happened back when Joseph F. Smith was president of the church. A couple came to him. They had been married just a short period of time. There were no children or anything, but they said they just were not getting along. And President Smith said, the power to seal is the power to loosen. And if they're not getting along, we can loosen this. It would be better for them to find spouses with whom they can be happier. Now, we don't want people to use that as an excuse to leave a marriage that's tough, because marriage is always tough. But we have to recognize that during the millennium, the power to seal and get everybody who's worthy sealed into the chain back to Adam is also the power to loosen. And our free agency will never be removed. No woman's going to be married to a man or a man to a woman that they are not choosing using their own agency. And if there's polygamy there in some form, we know that no person is going to be forced into that against their agency. So, I mean, the key here is just stay in the covenant path. Okay, do the things that are righteous. Keep your covenants that we make in the temple, and all of these things are going to work themselves out. It's a faith position. It's a faith position. We cannot know that polygamy in eternity would be okay. We can't even fathom what that would mean, and so we have to have faith that if that's going to occur and affect any of us, that it's going to be all right.
There's also this myth that the new and everlasting covenant is polygamy, and that's not the way I understand it. That's not the way I read it. Can you give us some clarity on the new and everlasting covenant?
Yeah, if you read section 132, verse 1 talks about Joseph's question. He asks, how did the old patriarchs have a plurality of wives? And then what God says, he says, I'm going to answer you, Joseph, and I'm going to give you the new and everlasting covenant, and anyone who doesn't obey it is damned. And he repeats that again in verses 4 and 6. And I bet at that point Joseph's going, whoa, okay, if I don't do this new covenant thing, I'm damned. I'm going to pay attention to what's going on here. And then God, in the next 20 verses, doesn't mention polygamy once. What he talks about is eternal marriage.
Yes.
The new and everlasting covenant is eternal marriage. How do we know that? Well, a couple of reasons, but one is verses 19 and 20 talk about a man who marries a woman in the new and everlasting covenant. See, it has to have proper authority, going back to the one man who holds the keys. Can't freelance it. Verse 18 tells us that. And the a man marries a woman by proper authority. They live worthily. They become exalted. Godhood and all of those incredible descriptions that are there. It's monogamy. It's exaltation. And if you read fundamentalist literature, and I've read quite a lot of it over the years, they don't like to talk about section 132. They're hard pressed to make it command polygamy. And certainly even if they want to redefine it, and sometimes they do, they'll say the new and everlasting covenant, and they'll put a bracket in their plural marriage bracket or put a asterisk or a footnote to redefine it. But that's not what it says. The scripture that Joseph Smith dictated is one that tells us a monogamous couple who live worthy and they're sealed by proper authority are exalted. That's what the new and everlasting covenant is. It's eternal marriage.
Okay. I love that we're clarifying some things here. Here's another thing some people will take in section 132 and it'll say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were justified. And people will say, well, Isaac, as far as we know, didn't have a polygamous relationship. How do you respond to people that bring that up as a way to point at DNC 132 and saying, see, this is a problem? How do you respond to that? I mean, as far as I can read in the Bible, I don't see Isaac having more than one wife. That doesn't mean that he didn't. I'm just saying that the Bible doesn't confirm that. But have you heard that argument before?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And, you know, it's just unfortunate because these are usually people that are trained at least a little bit in using the skills of a historian or a scholar. They're going to recognize that if one source says that something happened and the other one doesn't say that it didn't, we shouldn't think they're contradicting each other. In other words, the Bible doesn't describe Isaac as a polygamist. I mean, let's all agree on that. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't. It doesn't say Isaac the monogamous did this, this, this. It just says Isaac was married to this woman. It doesn't make it exclusive. And it's just unfortunate logic when we see this kind of discussion, this kind of theory being advanced. Because, yeah, it's very clearly there in section 132. It's not in the Bible, but you can't prove a negative. You can't prove that Isaac wasn't a polygamist. Simply because it's not mentioned in the Bible. And that's kind of the problem that we're running into.
Thank you for watching this episode on Zion Media. And I'm actually here to let you know that we have a sponsor. It's Oracle code. Now, you've heard us talking about Oracle code a couple times. It's an algorithm and application that we're actually designing, and it actually tells you not only a little bit about yourself, but we've been able to adjust this algorithm or this basically this app in a way that allows us to make a song for people. And some of the responses that we're getting is that this song is almost like a patriarchal song, because when people see what their oracle code says about them, they say it's like, whoa, that's like my patriarchal blessing or like a special message just for me. And then when we make a song out of it, it makes it even more unique and more attuned to who you are and your purpose here on life. And so, really excited about that. The way you get access to your Oracle code and song is by go ahead and using the QR code that's on screen or going in the link in the description and filling out the form so that way you can be able to get your own Oracle code. I'm really excited to be able to be a part of this transformation and this blessing in people's lives. And I look forward to hearing what your Oracle code says about you today.
Got it. Okay, cool. All right. So with all of this that's happening, and I'm sure you've seen it online, I've actually seen you on Michelle Stone's channel. Why do you think this is? And maybe it's just because I'm new to this space, but it seems like this whole thing has resurfaced again. The concept of polygamy and the historicity of polygamy has all of a sudden come bubbling back to the surface. Why is it that we don't just move on, focus on, you know, the gospel of Jesus Christ and not worry about this stuff? Why is it coming to the forefront again? Why do you think we're seeing this resurgence on this topic?
Um, I think, the topic's kind of always been there. But what we have in Michelle Brady Stone is someone with a lot of skills and abilities. I often thought, and this is a year ago, I thought, golly, if I were the president of the company, I'd like to hire her to promote whatever it was that I was selling because I think she does a really fine job that way. Um, but there's a certain desire to separate the church and Joseph from plural marriage because because it's unfair. There is a fear among a lot of members, probably most members at some level, for some, at least at some point, that Joseph Smith may have been wrong. That he and I've had people tell me this. In fact, when I started my research on Joseph Smith, I had a member of my family come to me and say, "Brian, don't do this. Just stop." She said, and she was very sincere. She said, Joseph just made a mistake and he can be forgiven and just let it go. And so people get worried that it was libido that was driving this, not an angelic command. And it's understandable. I mean, it's hard to wrap our heads around a practice that really men could do, women can't. It's unfair. There's no way to talk about it and make us feel good about it. It's unequal. And we're so, our sensitivities today on gender inequality are, they're very heightened, understandably. And so we can talk about it all day and almost nothing is going to make us feel good about a practice that falls into this category. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a vibrant testimony of the Savior and stay in the covenant path and be faithfully patient. But getting back to the movement, it started quite small. I was on Michelle Brady Stone's show. I think it was episode 50 or something like that. It was towards the end of, I think, her first year. And I tried to go on and explain to her that Joseph Smith taught, and he taught it very plainly. He said, it's not the economy of God to give somebody a revelation for those that are over them. And then what's more important is he said that the doctrines and the history of the church are maintained by the key holders. In other words, if there is going to be a change or if there's been a mistake in how we've interpreted history, God is going to reveal it to the key holders who in God's time will correct it. The key holders today, from Russell M. Nelson through all of our general authorities, teach us that Joseph did introduce plural marriage and that now it's no longer being commanded. That's the message that we have from the key holders. And so it's very bold for anyone, including Michelle, to come out and just say, no, I don't believe the key holders. I'm going to be a member of this church that's presided over by the key holders, but I don't agree with them. They're wrong. And I, when before I was called on this mission, I wanted to kind of not be too strong on this point. But let me point out one thing to you, Shane and David. I'm sorry I'm doing all the talking tonight.
No, we want you. Hey, you're our featured guest. We want you to do all the talking.
But the message that's advanced by our monogamy affirmers with respect to Joseph Smith, and many of them they're really good people. They're very sincere, but the message that they advance has a part of it that they don't tell you about that will bring a person into apostasy. And I've made the comment that polygamy denying is the halfway house to apostasy. With its and let me explain why that is. Because see, if we say Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy, if we just isolate those denials and we make them be a lot more than they really ever were, and if we ignore multiple eyewitness testimonies and affidavits and depositions and other sources, if we can actually make that work in our head, then we have to confront the reality that Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Lorenzo Snow all described how Joseph Smith did enter polygamy and instructed them to enter into polygamy, even presiding over some of their plural marriages. So what that does is the message is Joseph was a monogamist, and the next 4 presidents of the church are all liars in a very deep way, in a disturbing way. They're part of a conspiracy. Now, you tell me, how can somebody believe that the keys of authority could have passed through these 4 men as described as liars, deceivers? We could use nicer terms if we want, but you understand what I'm saying. How could we believe that on the other end of this and ending up with Russell M. Nelson, we have truth or we have authority? That's tough. I think that's a lot harder to believe that story, that is to remain true to the church and the keys today, believing Joseph was a monogamist, than it is to just accept that he did introduce plural marriage. I don't think people will do that. I would dare say some of the strong advocates of this, if we will fast forward 5 years or maybe 10, let's just see where their belief is in at least the keys of the that are held by our leaders today. I don't think that they're going to fare well with respect to that. And let me lastly just say that anybody who calls Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, or Lorenzo Snow a liar, a deceiver, whatever term we want to use, to me, that's an apostate message. That is the words, that is the message of an apostate.
Well, if you go to the temple, we are instructed to not speak ill of the Lord's anointed, and each one of those men were the Lord's anointed. So that doesn't mean they were perfect. That doesn't mean that they did everything perfect. I'm sure that they're mortal men and they made mistakes, but I affirm that the keys passed, and I affirm that they were God's prophet on the earth, and I affirm that they did what the Lord commanded them to do during that time. And if you read the historical record, yes, you're going to find they made mistakes. And that's just the nature of being a human being. They're not perfect people, but God doesn't use perfect people. There's only one perfect person, and we know who that is. Okay, I like that. Now, my last question on this, and then I want to move on to the topic that you mentioned, the one mighty and strong. But my last question is about William Marks. In all of your research, William Marks is said to have said that Joseph came to him, I don't know if you know the quote, right before he died and said, this polygamy, it's a mess. We need to put a stop to it. Something, I'm paraphrasing here, but I see people using that and William Marks's testimony to confirm kind of what you said earlier, that the person that came to you and said, hey, I think Joseph made a mistake here. How do you respond? Is William Marks somebody that should be trusted based on your research of this? And maybe you're not familiar with his quote, maybe his quote's not legitimate. I don't know.
There's William Marks' story about how he, as the state president, was supposed to do a witch hunt for all the polygamists has some glaring problems. One of them is that it's well documented that on August 12th of 1843. This is a month after the revelation was written down, that it was read by Hiram to the High Council. And many of these men had already entered into plural marriage, or they would do so later. But for William Marks to use his High Council to put on trial the polygamists when they heard from Hiram's own mouth the revelation justifying it. See, that just doesn't, the logic there is not good. The you wouldn't expect that Joseph would do that. The other side of it is that Joseph knew every authorized polygamist. If somebody came into Nauvoo and they were practicing polygamy and Joseph hadn't authorized it through the keys of the authority, he knew that they should be excommunicated, and they were. Hiram Brown is a guy, and I'm forgetting other names, but sometimes the monogamy affirmers will say, well, see, Joseph excommunicated Hiram Brown, therefore we know Joseph was against polygamy. No, Joseph Smith was against unauthorized polygamy. And so anybody who was in Nauvoo, who was practicing plural marriage and wasn't doing it with Joseph's authority, then they needed to be excommunicated because
I
that
see. That
they
makes sense.
so, you can't use those actions as evidence that he wasn't, and it is secret, and we don't like secrets, right? And we don't think our leaders should be having secrets, and that makes sense. But in the state of Illinois, if he consummated those marriages, he could be brought up for adultery, which was a state crime. And so he had to be careful who he was teaching that to, but he had plans to go to the Rocky Mountains where they would hopefully have more freedom on that topic. And so it was a short-term, Band-Aid. Let's just keep this secret for now. But the intent was eventually to talk about it more openly and live it more openly in the Rocky Mountains.
Okay, last question on this. It just came to my mind because this is another thing that people say. Well, Joseph didn't have any children with any of these wives, so I assume that that's true. If polygamy is a way to multiply and replenish the earth, like he didn't do a very good job at that, if that's the case. But I mean, I'm of the opinion he was introducing it, he was practicing it. The historical record tells me that. Was it just a function of a different kind of polygamy, or he just didn't have any kids with these women? Like in the historical record, how do you see that?
Yeah, very commonly brought up. I appreciate you mentioning that, Shane. Um, People will say there's no evidence he had children, and that actually is false. That's inaccurate. There is evidence he had children. There's just no DNA evidence that he had children. There
Ah,
are 8 individuals that were tested by my friend Hugo Perigo, who just lives somewhere here in Nauvoo. I need to go look him up. But he's a geneticist. The people approached him. The people in Joseph Smith family approached him saying, check out this DNA thing. 8 individuals have been shown not to be Joseph's offspring. These are some of the most likely candidates, according to the critics. And there probably won't be any others tested, I'm guessing, as these generations pass down. Most of this testing occurred, 10, 20 years ago. And so they had access to DNA that we don't have access to now because the people have died. But there is evidence of Joseph Smith having children. Mary Elizabeth Rollins on more than one occasion remembered, yeah, he had 2 or 3. They went by other names. They were raised in other families. And then there's an account from George A. Smith's wife, Bathsheba, that one night George A. Smith was going up to the mansion house, and Joseph was outside washing his hands, and George says, "What is up?" I guess they use that kind of talk even back then, but he said, "What is up?" And Joseph said, "Well, one of my plural wives has just delivered, and Emma was the midwife." And we do know Emma did accept this for a time. But there's no timeline for exactly when this would be, but if it was the mansion, it would have been late 43 or in 44. But see, that's evidence. This is historical evidence, at least 2 accounts from people independent of each other talking about Joseph having children with his plural wives. And we have at least probably a half a dozen pretty good documentation of sexual relations in these relationships. Although Joseph was so busy, there's no way this was occurring very often. 3 women in the Temple lot depositions said that they had, sexual relations, carnal intercourse was the term. I'm sure the women were mortified to actually testify to that. But see, it was a crux issue because if these were spiritual marriages, then it didn't matter. Who cared? If they want to, say they have a spiritual marriage, but if it's consummated, in that case, you have a genuine plural marriage. And these women, the three that they called to testify, all testified to that relationship with Joseph.
Okay. Now, transitioning and we'll wrap up here. And Ryan, I appreciate you taking the time. It's so cool to have somebody like you on our channel talking about this stuff. Somebody who's actually done the research, written books on this topic, not somebody who's reading some online forum that thinks they figured something out because somebody said something on some online forum. So I appreciate having somebody here that's done the research and can quote these things. Now, we talked briefly before we started recording, and we've had this topic on, we've had people on talking about the one mighty and strong, the Davidic servant, the servant that prepares the way, the Elias that's to come, the root of Jesse, all of these names. And you had mentioned something that you've done some research and some work on that. I'd love to get your thoughts and insight on this topic.
Well, the issue today, and let me just say that my first interest was with fundamentalist polygamy, and that's the Alger group. And I have friends amongst these, and they're really good people, and I love them, and I wish them the best if as much as we can. But the point that we need to understand when we start talking about some outsider coming inside to set in order the house of God or to make great changes in the church is that Joseph Smith taught that one man holds the keys of the priesthood. He controls them all. He's the president of the high priesthood. He is as Moses. He's in the church because if he transgresses, it's a council of the church that tries him. It's not some
Right.
outside council of friends or high priest apostle group. If you study Joseph's teachings, it's really very plain. One man is holding the keys and presiding over all priesthood. And so if we're going to bring in some outsider, how is that outsider going to interface with the one man on earth who holds the keys of the priesthood? He's either going to be subservient or he's going to have more authority. But if he says he has more authority, then the reality is he's not described in the scriptures. There's nothing
Right.
in Joseph Smith's teachings that would justify the belief that somebody with higher priesthood authority is ever going to appear and make a change. But that brings us up to section 85. And there's a verse there, verse 7, that talks about a one mighty and strong. And among the fundamentalists, the one mighty and strong has been a huge issue right from the very beginning, because what it says is he's going to set in order the house of God. And so the fundamentalist and most of them practice plural marriage, but they're going to say, aha, we know that the house of God is the church. It's going to be out of order. And then the one mighty and strong is going to show up. He's going to put it into order and we're going to be vindicated. And our plural marriages will be acceptable in the church because now they're just outside of the church. And on that topic, let me just sidebar for just a second, because if we want to ask the question, where are the keys of the priesthood? And my first book talked about the different lines. I mentioned them earlier. There are lines that come through a guy named Lord Woolley. There are a line through Eldon Kingston. There's a line through the LeBarons, and then there's others that have popped up, independents and things. But the man who holds the keys to seal an eternal marriage also has the keys to gather Israel. He also has the keys to do temple work.
Right.
So if we're going to say, well, let's see, who would the candidates
Prophet.
be today?
It's the
Well,
prophet.
yeah, Russell Nelson is doing all of those things.
Right.
Now, if we look at any of the other fundamentalist leaders like this Lord Woolley, we could ask, how many missionaries did he send out? The answer is 0. If we look at their line of authority, how many missionaries? Here's a guy who has the keys to gather Israel, and they're doing nothing about it. That's an evidence that they really don't have those keys. Now,
Right.
Reuben
They're not building temples like we're building temples. They're not sending missionaries like we're sending missionaries. So if that's their job to do, I would say they're failing at it. And I can point to a succession of guys who have been very successful at that, including our current prophet, President Nelson.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to see the temple building. But this is my plea for my fundamentalist friends, because back in 1989, when I confronted this question, I thought, well, are the keys outside of the church? And I looked for them. I was never impressed by the claims of these people, and I'm afraid what happens with these people today, these modern polygamists, is that they read the party line, you could almost call it propaganda, and then they fall on their knees and they pray and they say, "Oh, I know he has the keys." Well, I think God requires us to study it out in our mind. If he has the keys outside of the church, where did he get them? Follow it back and study the claims. And in every case, they're not impressive to me, and that would be the thing to pray about. Is once you get back and you discover that Lord Woolley is talking about getting keys 35 years earlier, and he never mentioned it, and nobody else did who was supposedly with him. I mean, that's a big problem. So any of these lines of authority, if we want to put our entire salvation on the line with them, let's study the line out and then pray, or pray as we're studying, but don't just hear the story and fall on our knees. That's the warning that we might offer. Now, let's get back to section 85, and the one mighty and strong. He's going to set in order the house of God. Now, that's one duty. If we go back and read the verses, he has a second duty, which is almost always ignored. Almost across. In fact, you can say, "Don't you know about the second duty?" And they'll say, "What? There's no second duty." A lot of people who embrace this idea. And the second duty is he's going to divide by lot the inheritances of the
Right.
saints. See, I believe, and there's ambiguity here, I acknowledge that, but when it says he's going to set in order the house of God, he's talking about the temple in Independence. Because if you look at the plat of the 1833 plat of the city there in Independence, what do we see in the center? What is set in order right in smack dab in the center? It's the temples. There's 24 of them drawn there. We don't quite know what
Right.
configuration, what that really meant. Orson Pratt made some descriptions later, but what we find is you cannot assign by lot the inheritances of the saints, which are the building lots surrounding the temple. You couldn't do that until you've set in order the temple. The temple has to be placed in the center spot before you can do the second duty of the one mighty and strong. See, it's talking about a specific time and a place. The house of God is not talking about the church in the latter days. That verbiage could be used, as I mentioned, but no, this is just a very specific revelation for that time and place. The saints apparently were able to repent because we don't have any record of one mighty and strong coming in and setting this all in order and then assigning the inheritances. Is this something that's going to happen later? I think Joseph S. Smith left the door open maybe for something like that to happen in the future. But the point is that if we're going to grab onto the idea that something out there really mysterious and really kind of cool is going to come in and change everything, we got to interface with the keys of the priesthood, which were so important to Joseph, and are frankly so important to us today. Because I see by your white shirts, I think you said you've been to the temple, and how can we do this without authority? We can't make covenants without ordinances.
Right.
We can't do ordinances without authority. You can't freelance that stuff. Blessings will not be there. So that's a great blessing to us today.
Yeah.
Well, I love it. Okay. Um, I got a final question as we wrap up here, and it has to do with the temple lot, but it also has to do with the Kirtland Temple. Um, Tell me a little bit about your thoughts of the church's acquisition of the Kirtland Temple, kind of what that means. Is that symbolic of, are we getting closer and closer to that time that has always been fast approaching? I feel as though when I hear the prophet speak, he's talking about the Lord hastening his work. Um, Talk to me about your thoughts when you heard about the church acquiring the Kirtland Temple and these other assets. Being a church historian, does that trigger anything? Does that symbolize anything? That was the first temple built that is now back in the possession of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Give me some of your thoughts, or maybe some of the things you're thinking about that transaction.
Well, we're very, very grateful to the community of Christ, Loch Mackay, and others that I have many friends there in the community of Christ for taking care of these so well over the decades. And as far as the timeline goes, of course, God can be in anything. But the reality is that the community of Christ was in a financial state that was creating difficulties for maintaining their retirement obligations. And I had a friend, I won't use names, but when the church purchased, well, it wasn't the church, I think it was a group of investors, but when the printer's manuscript was sold for $35 million, you remember that story? I can't remember how long it's been. A member of the community of Christ who actually I think was then employed by them was just in tears and just crying about this on the day that it happened. And a friend of mine approached her and asked, "What are you crying about? I mean, are you so sad that you're losing this manuscript?" And these were tears of joy because the money was going to be able to help them out of a financial challenging time. Now fast forward, to the acquisition of these other properties and things. I mean, it was expedient because of the financial side of things. I'm not reading anything into it as far as it being a symbol or something of the second coming. I mean, President Nelson has told us about the second coming, but that's as close as death for any of us. And as I get older, we can, for us, I mean, once we pass through the veil, the second coming will be
It's right there.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah, at least maybe symbolically. So, he hasn't told us that we need to, start using our year supply or anything, but he tells us to get prepared as he might as if it were decades away. Frankly, that's how I see it. So, the shorter answer to your question is I don't read anything into the timeline of us acquiring these properties. We're just grateful to have them because the community of Christ has moved away from the teachings in Nauvoo, and the restoration of the sealing authority in Kirtland Temple. Again, it's not something that they embraced. The tour that you took there was very much about the architecture. The tour you take today is about that event and the visions that were appreciated there. So that's something that's good for us. But again, I don't know that I'd read too much into it.
And then, last question, as it relates to the temple lot, do you see a day when the LDS Church acquires the temple lot? Is it necessary that they acquire the temple lot? Does it do we have to have the temple lot in order for prophecy to be fulfilled? And does a temple need to be built on that particular piece of ground? What do you see there?
You moved outside of my expertise, even such as it is. But I wish I had Gene Adams here because he could probably help us out more. But I'm not worried about it. I don't know that we'll ever acquire it because there's nothing going on there that would require a lot of funding. The Church of Christ Temple Lot are taking very good care of that space. And, I don't know there's anything magic about that space, and honestly, a temple could be built there at any time in the future, and I think fulfill all of the prophecy that are attached to that site. And if we wanna be generous with the temple, uh, lot, prophecies and all, the church actually does own a corner of that space where we have the visitors center, and then you go up the hill, and you've got the stake center there. A temple could be built in that, and technically, I think fulfill much of the prophecy, if not all of it. Again, we're outside of areas that I've studied, but the
Gotcha.
church has property there that they could have used instead of building the Kansas City temple way out north. If you just drive along, is it I-35 or I-29? I can't remember, and you just see it there. It's like, whoa, this is pretty cool. Let's go see what that is. So.
Awesome. Well, Brian, thank you so much for taking the time. Tell me a little bit about what's kind of next for you. And it sounds like Nauvoo's just you got an RV, so it seems like you're kind of on the go and on the move. What are some of the other spots you're going to go and see, and some of the other repositories you're going to go visit as you continue this research on the prophet Joseph Smith?
Great question. Not sure I have an answer. We are given topics. I think all of the researchers are being assigned to specific areas to research, and I don't know much about any of the other details other than we've been given a couple of topics that we are to be looking at, And right now we're here. We think we'll probably be going into Missouri and doing additional research. But it's not we honestly don't know. Our full-time mission will end at the end of October, but we right now plan to maybe even leave the RV here and then go back and keep serving as a service missionary if they would have us. And then we could keep just going around. If there's places that somebody who's supervising us tells us to go, we'll be happy to just head off. I couldn't be happier to be here with my sweet wife Janice and researching Joseph Smith. That's just like a heavenly retirement for me. I feel very blessed.
Awesome. Well, Brian, thank you so much for taking the time with us. Hey, if you happen to get a text message while you're out there about some secret meeting at Adam on Diamond, will you just throw my name in there and make sure you just if they say, hey, I have this guy, I want to let him know. I'd appreciate that. But thank you so much for coming on and imparting your wisdom. I appreciate all the research that you bring to the table. It's nice to have somebody on, like I said, who's really digging in and has dug in and has written books on these various topics. So thank you for your perspective and for your insight and for coming on Zion Media. I actually am really excited about the Origins of the Book of Mormon book that you're going to be coming out with. That's definitely going to be on my bookshelf back here as soon as that comes out. And I look forward to hopefully having you back on to talk about that. I love I say the word the Book of Mormon and literally chills come over me. I love the Book of Mormon. I read the Book of Mormon every day. It is, I tell people, this is my treasure right here. This is my Book of Mormon from prison. So Brian, I don't know if you know this, but I spent 5 years in prison on securities fraud. I call it my 5-year mission. And this was the Book of Mormon that I had to study out of it.
Wow.
And of all my possessions, other than my beautiful bride, and my children, this is it. This has, when I was in that space, has all my notes, and this Book of Mormon means a lot to me. So I appreciate the work you're doing on the origins of the Book of Mormon. So thank you for that. So David Douglas, do you have any final thoughts as we wrap up here? This was an awesome.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because we were just talking about the one mighty and strong in a group text that I'm in right now. And it was just great to get some of your insight. So thank you very much for coming on and hope to have you again sometime.
Okay. Thanks. Hey,
Well,
if you like this video, oh, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say I'd love to come back when the book comes out, and congratulations, Shane. I didn't know that about your background, and you're doing great stuff. It's super. I'm excited for you.
Hey,
Thank you for having
they
me.
call, yeah, it on another time, I'll have to tell you about that experience. I was worth millions and millions of dollars and told the Lord I was willing to go live in a tent. The FBI had investigated me in 2012 on securities fraud. They decided not to indict me. I went on this quest for finding my purpose. And by about 2015, I told the Lord, I'm willing to go. I just want to know what my purpose is. I will go live in a tent. Be careful what you ask for, because then the state of Utah picked up those charges and I found myself in an 80-foot cell. And that was the tent God wanted me to live in.
Well, you're doing
So,
great things now, and it sounds like you were good there as a missionary too. So
hey, the atonement is infinite and eternal and is even for a guy like me. So, anyways, thank you so much. Oddly enough, we're talking about prison. And if you can see my phone, the Utah State Prison is calling me. It's one of the inmates calling me, wanting to chat with me. I still have some dear friends, dear brothers in Christ in prison. So, anyways, thank you, Brian, for coming on. Hey, if you like this video, just smash the like button and let's share it. Let's get all sides of this conversation going. Let's not just watch one podcast and because somebody supposedly read something and they said something that now that's true. Let's check and verify everything that we hear out there. And let's see all sides of the argument, especially when it comes to the prophet Joseph Smith and the history of polygamy. So, Brian, thank you so much. For myself, I'm Shane
thank you.
Baldwin. For my co-host, David the Lion Douglas, and our amazing guest, Brian Hales. We'll see you guys all next time.